Beneath a forgotten plantation, where weeds clawed through cracked brick and time peeled away every trace of grandeur, something waited in darkness. For a century, the ground itself had been sealed, layered with soil, debris and silence, as if the land had been commanded to swallow a secret no one wanted remembered. Above it stood a decaying mansion, creaking in the wind, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes that had seen too much. Locals spoke of an unseen structure buried far below, a hidden basement erased from maps and erased from memory. They said the earth trembled on stormy nights, as though something trapped beneath was still alive, still moving, still desperate to be heard. Children were warned never to dig near the old foundation, and elders crossed themselves whenever the plantation was mentioned. Then one day the soil cracked open. Heavy machinery struck something solid beneath the roots of ancient trees. What emerged was not just a basement, but a locked tomb of history, filled with evidence that the plantation had buried more than stone. As light touched that darkness for the first time in 100 years, the truth began to rise from the depths, colder and more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. If stories like this grip your heart and send chills down your spine, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the truth hidden beneath history. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice is part of this journey. The plantation rose from the swampy lowlands like a scar that never closed, its cracked columns leaning under the weight of centuries of brutality. Built in the early 19th century on stolen indigenous land, it was designed not merely as a home, but as a machine of exploitation that fed on black labor, broken bodies, and erased lives. Vast cotton fields stretched endlessly in every direction, their beauty masking a system built on terror. Visitors once saw only white-painted verandas, sweeping oak trees, and a grand mansion glistening in the sun, yet beneath that polished surface lay a foundation soaked in pain, punishment, and silence. Every brick, every beam, and every inch of soil carried the imprint of those who were forced to toil there without freedom or humanity. At first light, enslaved men, women, and children were driven from their cabins before the sky turned pink, their bare feet cutting through dew-soaked grass as overseers watched from horseback. Whips cracked like thunder across the fields, echoing over the swamp and into the forest, warning that any sign of resistance would be crushed without mercy. Mothers worked beside their children, knowing that exhaustion or illness meant nothing to the owners, who measured worth only in profit. At night, faint songs drifted from the slave quarters, songs of longing, grief, and survival that the wind carried across the plantation grounds. Yet even those melodies felt haunted, as if the land itself absorbed their sorrow. The mansion at the center of the estate stood in cruel contrast to this suffering, filled with imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, and portraits of proud white ancestors. Guests were entertained with lavish feasts, while enslaved cooks prepared meals they would never taste. Behind closed doors, however, the owners maintained hidden spaces designed for punishment and control, far from the eyes of visitors. Cellars, sheds, and unknown chambers were rumored to exist beneath the house, places spoken of only in fearful whispers. The family presented themselves as refined and religious, yet their wealth was carved directly from human misery buried deep beneath their feet. Over time, the plantation gained a chilling reputation among nearby communities, especially among the descendants of enslaved families who had escaped or been freed. They spoke of disappearances that were never explained, of people who were taken inside the main house and never seen again. Some claimed that screams once echoed through the night before suddenly falling silent. Others insisted that the ground beneath the mansion felt different, colder, heavier, as if something hidden there was watching and waiting. These stories were passed down through generations, becoming part of local memory even when outsiders dismissed them as folklore. As decades passed, the estate changed hands, yet its dark legacy remained intact beneath layers of renovation and decay. New owners attempted to rewrite history, repainting walls, burning old records, and restoring the grand facade while ignoring what lay below. Weather slowly ate away at the plantation, causing roofs to sag and foundations to crack, but the ground beneath the mansion remained untouched. Thick roots of ancient trees twisted deep into the soil, weaving around something that had been deliberately buried long ago. The silence around that buried structure grew heavier with every passing year. By the late 19th century, when slavery was abolished, the plantation no longer functioned as it once had, yet the hidden truth beneath it was never uncovered. Former enslaved people who lived nearby avoided the property, believing that disturbing the land would awaken something dangerous. Some swore they felt tremors beneath their feet during storms, as though the earth itself was shifting in unrest. Even animals seemed to sense something was wrong, refusing to graze too close to the mansion's foundation. The buried basement became less a physical space and more a shadow that hovered over the entire estate. As the 20th century arrived, the plantation faded into ruin, its grandeur replaced by decay, yet its buried past remained locked beneath layers of dirt, stone, and silence. Tourists who later visited saw only crumbling beauty, unaware that beneath their feet lay a structure intentionally hidden for nearly 100 years. The land carried the weight of everything that had happened upon it, waiting for the moment when cracks in the earth would finally reveal what the plantation had tried so desperately to erase. Whispers about a hidden space beneath the plantation began long before anyone dared to call it a basement. Among enslaved families, stories circulated of low, distant thudding sounds that seemed to rise from the earth at night, as if something massive was moving far below the mansion. Elders spoke of seeing lantern light flicker through cracks in the foundation long after the house appeared empty. These were not casual ghost tales, but guarded memories, told only in hushed tones when children slept, and the wind was still. To them, the ground beneath the house was not solid land, but a living thing that breathed and remembered. Early maps of the estate, later discovered in county archives, showed faint, irregular markings beneath the main building that did not match any known structure. Some drawings hinted at a lower level that had been deliberately erased, smudged, or torn away over time. Cartographers of the era rarely made such mistakes, which made historians uneasy. Yet for decades these clues were ignored, dismissed as errors rather than evidence. Meanwhile, locals continued to insist that the plantation stood on top of something buried far deeper than simple foundations. Former workers who had been brought to the property after emancipation recalled strange orders from owners to avoid digging near the house. Any attempt to plant trees, build sheds, or repair the foundation was abruptly halted if workers approached a certain perimeter. Tools would be confiscated, and people warned that the soil there was unstable or cursed. These excuses varied over time, but the boundary never changed, as though an invisible circle guarded what lay beneath. Children growing up nearby learned to feel the difference in the land without being told. They claimed that when they pressed their ears to the ground near the mansion, they could hear faint echoes like distant knocking. Some said the earth vibrated during thunderstorms, as if something underground reacted to the power of the storm. Parents quickly pulled them away, afraid that curiosity might disturb whatever was hidden below. Fear became instinct long before it became explanation. Old plantation ledgers, later uncovered in dusty attics, contained cryptic references to structural repairs that made little sense. Entries spoke of reinforced walls, sealed entrances, and shipments of heavy iron delivered in secrecy at night. Yet no records showed where these materials were used above ground. The absence of clarity only deepened suspicion that something significant had been built and then buried. Every clue pointed downward, toward a space no one wanted to acknowledge. Travelers who passed through the area in earlier decades wrote in diaries about an eerie heaviness around the mansion. Some described feeling as if the ground beneath them was hollow, like standing atop a vast, empty chamber. Others mentioned hearing muffled sounds at dusk that seemed to rise from the soil itself. Though they could not explain what they sensed, their observations aligned unsettlingly with local rumors of a hidden structure buried far below. By the time historians and archaeologists began taking these stories seriously, the legends of the hidden basement had become deeply woven into community memory. What had started as whispers among enslaved families had survived generations of silence, abandonment, and decay. The plantation was no longer just a ruined house above ground, but a layered site of buried truth waiting beneath it. The decision to seal the hidden basement beneath the plantation did not happen in a single moment, but through years of fear, calculation, and moral collapse. As slavery began to face growing opposition, the plantation owners realized that what lay beneath their mansion could one day be exposed to public scrutiny. They understood that the basement was not merely a storage space or forgotten foundation, but a chamber tied to acts so brutal that even their own peers might have condemned them. Instead of confronting or dismantling it, they chose concealment, believing that burying the truth beneath layers of earth would protect both their reputation and their legacy. Political pressure played a major role in their decision. As abolitionist movements grew stronger, wealthy landowners across the region became increasingly paranoid about investigations into their estates. The Plantation family feared that inspectors, journalists, or government officials might one day question the strange structure beneath their house. Rather than risk discovery, they ordered the basement sealed, filled with soil, rubble, and debris until it disappeared from sight. To them, hiding the evidence was easier than admitting the crimes it represented. Social reputation was another powerful motive behind the burial. The owners prided themselves on appearing cultured, religious, and respectable in the eyes of their community. Dinner parties, church donations, and public appearances all depended on maintaining a spotless image. If word spread that a secret underground chamber of punishment existed beneath their home, their social standing would crumble instantly. Sealing the basement became an act of self-preservation rather than remorse, a way to protect their name at the cost of truth. Legal concerns also weighed heavily on their minds. As laws slowly began to change after the end of slavery, there was a real possibility that past abuses could be questioned or prosecuted. Although many plantation owners escaped justice, the fear of legal consequences lingered. Burying the basement meant eliminating physical evidence that could link them to disappearances, torture, or death. In their view, dirt and silence were safer than walls that could speak. The physical process of sealing the basement was carried out under strict secrecy, often at night. Workers were brought in from distant areas and sworn to silence, sometimes under threat or bribe. Heavy stones, timber, and earth were used to block entrances, while remaining openings were carefully concealed beneath new construction. No official records were kept, ensuring that future generations would have no written proof of what had been done beneath their feet. Over time, the buried basement became less a deliberate act and more a tradition of silence passed down through ownership changes. New families who inherited the plantation were warned vaguely about something hidden below, but rarely told the full truth. Some chose ignorance, others feared what they might uncover, and so the seal remained intact. The earth above it thickened with roots, rubble, and decades of neglect, making the basement seem more like myth than reality. By the time a full century had passed, the reasons for sealing the basement had blurred into a mixture of fear, guilt, and denial. The plantation had decayed above ground, yet its buried secret remained perfectly preserved beneath layers of soil and silence, waiting for the day when history would finally refuse to look away. The morning the ground first gave way did not arrive with drama, only with an unsettling stillness that made even seasoned workers uneasy. Heavy excavation equipment rolled onto the property beneath a pale, washed-out sky, its metal teeth biting into soil that had not been touched in generations. The mansion loomed silently in the background, its cracked windows reflecting dull light like a body refusing to blink. As the machinery rumbled, birds scattered in chaotic flight, and even the wind seemed to fall flat, refusing to move through the dying oak trees that surrounded the foundation. No one spoke much, but every person there later admitted that the air felt wrong, thick with something they could not name. The first crack appeared without warning, a sudden fracture in the earth that spider-webbed outward like shattered glass. The machine operator felt the shift instantly, jerking back in his seat as the ground beneath the bucket trembled violently. Dust rose in a choking cloud, swirling in strange patterns that seemed to avoid the cracked area rather than settle over it. Nearby workers froze, their shovels hovering mid-air as a low, hollow sound echoed upward from below, deep and resonant like distant thunder trapped underground. For a brief moment, no one moved, as if afraid that the land itself might swallow them whole. When the dust cleared, a dark cavity had opened beneath the surface, far deeper than anyone expected. Flashlights were lowered cautiously, their beams swallowed by blackness that seemed to pulse rather than remain still. A cold breath of stale air rushed upward, carrying a stench of rot, iron, and something ancient that made stomachs twist. Several workers stepped back instinctively, crossing themselves or whispering prayers, while others stared in stunned silence at the hole that had revealed a buried world beneath their feet. The plantation, for the first time in a century, was exhaling. As equipment was repositioned, the opening widened, exposing rough brickwork buried beneath layers of soil and roots. Thick vines had wrapped around the hidden structure over decades, binding it tightly as if nature itself had tried to keep it sealed. Pieces of old timber protruded from the earth, splintered and blackened, suggesting entrances that had long ago been deliberately blocked. Cameras began rolling, capturing every tremor of the moment, yet the crew's hands shook too much to keep their lenses steady. It felt less like a discovery and more like an awakening. When the first ladder was lowered into the cavity, hesitation rippled through the group. No one wanted to be the first to descend into what had been buried for 100 years. Finally, a preservation expert volunteered, his voice steady but eyes wide with unease. As he disappeared into the darkness, those above heard his footsteps echo strangely, as though the space below stretched far wider than it appeared. Seconds felt like minutes, and the silence that followed was so heavy that several people thought something had gone terribly wrong. Then his voice crackled over a radio, thin and trembling, describing brick walls, corroded metal, and a cold so intense it burned his lungs. He spoke of stairways choked with dirt, broken beams hanging like teeth from a wounded mouth, and an atmosphere that pressed against his chest. From above, others strained to hear, gripping ropes and tools with white-knuckled hands. The buried basement was no longer rumor. It was a living, breathing void beneath them. One by one, more team members descended, their flashlights carving narrow paths through the suffocating darkness. Every movement sent faint vibrations through the earth, as if the structure resented being disturbed after so long. Outside, clouds gathered rapidly despite no forecast of rain, and distant thunder rolled across the horizon. The ground around the opening trembled again, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm that made everyone acutely aware of how fragile the boundary between past and present had become. The first descent into the buried basement felt less like entering a structure and more like crossing into another world that had been sealed away from time itself. The air at the bottom was unbearably heavy, thick with dust that clung to skin and settled in lungs with every breath. Flashlights cut through the blackness in trembling beams, revealing brick walls slick with moisture and streaked with dark stains that looked disturbingly organic. Every step echoed unnaturally, bouncing off unseen corridors that stretched farther than anyone expected. Several explorers paused, convinced they could feel eyes watching them from somewhere in the darkness, though nothing moved within their line of sight. The floor beneath their boots was uneven, layered with compacted soil, fallen debris, and shattered remnants of old wooden structures. In some areas, the ground dipped into shallow pits where roots from ancient trees had pierced through cracks in the ceiling above. Dripping water echoed like slow heartbeats, pooling into stagnant puddles that reflected faint light in eerie ripples. The basement felt vast, far larger than what surface measurements had suggested, giving the unsettling impression that it had been deliberately hidden rather than simply buried. No one spoke, yet their breathing filled the space with a tense, almost sacred silence. As they moved deeper, the walls began to reveal signs of intentional construction rather than natural collapse. Thick stone blocks lined the perimeter, carefully stacked in a way that suggested this had once been an organized, functional space. Rusted metal brackets protruded at regular intervals, hinting that heavy objects or restraints may have been mounted there long ago. In certain corners, dark imprints marked where something had once leaned against the wall for years, leaving behind ghostly outlines that refused to fade. The deeper they ventured, the colder the air became, chilling their bones despite the physical exertion of climbing down. At the center of the basement, the beam of a flashlight fell upon a set of descending stairs that appeared to lead even further underground. The steps were cracked, crumbling, and partially buried, yet clearly man-made. A foul smell wafted up from below, a blend of decay, iron, and something deeply human that made stomachs twist. One team member hesitated at the edge, feeling as if stepping downward meant leaving the world of the living entirely. The others sensed the same dread but pressed on, driven by both fear and determination. Lower still, they discovered remnants of old wooden platforms now warped and splintered, scattered across the space like broken bones. Chains hung from exposed beams above, their links corroded but still intact, swaying faintly in the disturbed air. Beneath them lay piles of rubble, mixed with fragments of cloth, rope, and unidentifiable objects that suggested prolonged human presence. Shadows danced wildly along the walls, twisting into shapes that made some believe they saw figures pressed against the brick, watching silently. Near the far wall, the explorers stumbled upon a narrow corridor branching off from the main chamber, its entrance partially blocked by fallen stones. The passage felt claustrophobic, its ceiling low and walls rough, as if designed to confine rather than shelter. Water trickled along the floor, forming a thin stream that led into deeper darkness. As flashlights probed ahead, faint marks appeared along the brickwork, scratches etched so deeply they could only have been made by desperate hands. The sense of human suffering here was impossible to ignore. When the team finally paused to absorb what they had seen, a profound stillness settled over the buried space. Dust drifted lazily through their beams of light, swirling in slow patterns that seemed almost alive. No wind, no sound, no movement existed beyond their own presence, yet the basement felt far from empty. The deeper they had gone, the clearer it became that this was not merely a forgotten foundation, but a place deliberately concealed, preserved beneath the earth as though the plantation itself had tried to swallow its darkest truth. As light swept across the buried basement, the first clear discoveries began to surface from the shadows, revealing that this space had never been meant for storage or shelter. Along the outer walls, heavy iron rings were embedded deep into the brick, their bolts rusted but still solid, suggesting they had once held bodies in place rather than objects. Beneath them, the floor was layered with compacted dirt, mixed with dark, crusted stains that had soaked so deeply into the earth they could never be fully removed. Fragments of leather straps, brittle with age, lay scattered nearby, their buckles still locked as if someone had been torn away in haste. Every detail pointed toward prolonged confinement rather than a single violent event. In the center of the chamber, explorers uncovered a large wooden platform partially buried beneath rubble and soil. Its surface was warped, cracked, and etched with deep scratches that ran in frantic, chaotic patterns. Broken shackles lay beside it, some snapped under extreme force, others twisted beyond recognition. Pieces of thick rope were knotted in complex loops, hardened with time and coated in residue that investigators struggled to identify. The structure did not resemble anything practical. It looked instead like a stage for suffering that had been abandoned mid-act and then deliberately concealed. As the team cleared more debris, they found stacks of metal tools corroded beyond use, including heavy tongs, serrated blades, and blunt instruments whose original purpose could only be guessed. Some were arranged neatly, as if someone had once taken great care in their organization, while others were scattered haphazardly across the floor. Nearby, a rusted brazier rested on its side, its interior blackened from repeated fires that must have burned for long periods. Ash had settled thickly around it, mingled with fragments of charred wood and fabric. Along one wall, a narrow alcove emerged, partially sealed off by collapsed brick. Inside it stood a skeletal frame made of wood and iron, designed to hold a person upright in total restraint. Thick collars and wrist cuffs dangled from it, their metal eaten away by rust but still recognizable. Deep scratch marks covered the brick behind the frame, carved so violently that chunks of stone had broken away over time. The air around this alcove felt colder and heavier, as though the space still carried the memory of whatever had once been trapped there. Scattered across the basement floor were deeply personal items that made the discovery feel unbearably human rather than merely historical. A broken comb, a rusted thimble, and a small carved wooden figure lay half buried in the dirt. Nearby rested scraps of torn cloth, some faded beyond color, others still stained dark. These were not possessions of owners or overseers, but traces of the people who had suffered beneath the plantation. Each object felt like a silent testimony that refused to be erased. Near the far corner, investigators uncovered a shallow pit lined with brick, partially filled with soil, debris, and fragmented bone. Whether these remains belonged to animals or humans was not immediately clear, but their presence sent a chill through everyone present. Iron hooks protruded from the pit's edges at regular intervals, suggesting something had once been suspended above it. The ground around the pit was densely packed, as though it had been disturbed and covered repeatedly over many years. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery was a heavy wooden chest found against the back wall, wrapped in thick chains and sealed with a massive padlock. Strange symbols had been burned into its surface, some resembling religious markings, others entirely unknown. Dust lay untouched across its lid, indicating that no hand had touched it since the basement was buried. Shadows seemed to shift around the chest whenever a flashlight passed over it, giving the impression that whatever lay inside had waited patiently in darkness for a century. The buried basement forced a devastating re-examination of the plantation owners who had long been remembered as respectable pillars of their community. For generations, their names appeared in local history books beside words like prosperous, pious, and benevolent, while portraits in nearby museums showed them dressed in fine attire with calm, composed expressions. Families who inherited their legacy spoke proudly of their ancestors' contributions to agriculture, architecture, and regional development. Yet, the discoveries beneath the mansion shattered this polished image, revealing that their wealth rested not only on forced labor, but on systematic cruelty hidden far below public view. Ledgers recovered from the basement told a chilling story of calculated control rather than random violence. Certain enslaved individuals were marked with coded symbols instead of names, suggesting they were treated differently from the rest. Marginal notes in the owner's handwriting referenced containment, isolation, and permanent removal, phrases that investigators later interpreted as deliberate confinement or worse. These records made it clear that the hidden basement was not a temporary holding space, but an institutionalized system of punishment, carefully planned and maintained over years. Further documents uncovered in the main house revealed correspondence between the Plantation family and neighboring elites who shared similar fears about resistance and rebellion. In veiled language, they discussed the need for underground measures to maintain order, implying that secret spaces like the buried basement were not unique to this estate. This suggested that the cruelty discovered beneath the mansion was part of a broader culture of power that thrived on secrecy, silence, and intimidation rather than justice or morality. Testimonies from descendants of enslaved families suddenly gained undeniable credibility when compared with the physical evidence. Stories of people disappearing into the house and never returning matched the restraints, chains, and confined structures found below ground. What had once been dismissed as exaggerated folklore now appeared to be painful memory passed down through generations who had no other way to preserve the truth. The plantation owners had not only inflicted suffering, but worked actively to erase proof of it from official history.